uncertainty, risk, pandemics are not going away. I mean, they are here to stay in different forms. We can manage them. But that has been what's been on my mind, is how do we accept this? How do we not get paralyzed by it? How do we keep our best thinking, you know, in the face of all these challenges that we have? And I believe there's something to learn in studying behavioral science, cognitive science, and, you know, the kind of things I'm interested in. There are lessons there for us to help us cope with uncertainty. It's not going to go away. You know, the world is not going to get simpler and more certain by, you know, by itself. And that's really what my general outlook is on things. And yet we could still make good decisions. We could still manage it. We really have to deploy, to get to higher levels sometimes of intelligence about all these things. That's kind of my starting point here.
Now, thank you, Philippe. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast. Welcome, everybody. We've got a great guest joining us today. We have Philippe Delquié, and Philippe is an associate professor at the George Washington University School of Business. So welcome, Philippe.
My pleasure. Pleasure to be here with you, Tamara, today.
Now, for those of you who don't know, Philippe will be talking at the EH&S Congress happening September the 13th to the 14th in Berlin. So we're hoping to see you there. And I wanted to kick this off really to understand, how did you get into the field of occupational health and safety?
Yes, I really became interested and associated with the field, you know, a few years back. It would be like about 14, 15 years ago now, with the inception of a executive development program that has been very successful at CEDEP Executive Education Club in Fontainebleau, France. I was asked to be associated with a program because I was interested in risk perception, how people make decisions in the face of uncertainty. That has been my area of research and scholastic activities for many, many years now. And I immediately recognized that there were lessons from what I had been studying that could be applied to health and safety. And I learned a lot, of course, about health and safety. That was not initially my field, but it became an area of applications, so to speak, for me, for my scholarly interests. So my association is not as a professional, is more like as an academic who is trying to, you know, bridge between, you know, a field of research in behavioral science and cognitive science and an area of application that is so important. It is getting ever more attention, and I find that it's been a very interesting journey for me. As I said, it started with a program that has been very successful, is still going under the leadership of Andrew Sherman, and still enjoying very much, you know, being engaged there.
Now, you spoke about risk perception. One of my questions for you is risk perception the same for everybody across the board?
Well, it is not, you know, the same for everybody across the board. You know, certainly people's perceptions of risk are determined by their experiences, by how much control they have faced. Let me give you a very simple example, even perhaps caricatural example. Think about skydiving, you know, jumping out of an airplane with simply a parachute, right? Some people pay, you know, to do it, to enjoy the fun of it. Some people would have to get paid handsomely to accept doing it, right? Some people would never want to get any close to that, even though if you look at the risks involved, first of all, they are actually pretty small. And they are risks that are very well known statistically. You know exactly what the probabilities of any kinds of happening could be doing such an activity, because that activity is very well documented. We've got lots of data. But yet, again, some people would be eager to do it. Some people would be absolutely staying far away from it, right? So clearly risk perceptions, can differ a lot. But what the research, pioneer research from Paul Slovic at the University of Oregon, and others, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, these are people that I know their work very well, their seminal work very well, and there are many others, of course. But what the research has shown is that humans are not very good at apprehending, or how should I say, appraising the risks and the uncertainties that surround them. And we're not just good with probabilities. We're not good with statistics naturally. This is not in human nature to be able to do these assessments correctly. Even though we may have a lot of experience with things, we may be exposed to a lot of instances of things, our perceptions can be distorted. And it's been well documented in behavioral science and in cognitive science how people's appraisals of risk and uncertainties are actually systematically biased in certain ways. We tend to overweight certain risks, overestimate them, particularly those big things that are spectacular, like nuclear power accident, and these kind of things may be very salient in our heads. And yet other risks that are small, due to repetition of things and so on, we tend to underestimate them. So we need to sort of make a concrete effort to be able to have a more accurate and more balanced perception of all these things. That's what a lot of the research I was citing has taught us, really.
Okay, so that's interesting. So if we drill down then into risk management, right? And one of the responsibilities of a health and safety professional is trying to eliminate and mitigate risks. One of the things I found very interesting is some people will turn to PPE in order to do this, and other people, and I'm in the other people camp, will be looking at eliminating and mitigating through design and through, like, even before the worker comes into the work environment. Is that because I have a different perception of like, why is that? Why do some people go to the design mode and others go to, say, direct PPE?
Well, I think both, all these approaches are valid and have a role to play, really. If you can design the choice architecture, the environment, so that people will be safer, of course, we need to do that. That is exactly, I think you're putting your finger on something very important here. Understanding what drives behavior and risk perception better gives us the keys to designing interventions that will work. Should it be through better training, through elevating people's awareness or education about things, or even judgment, sharpening their judgment about risks, uncertainties, and safety issues that surround them. That's one thing. And others are about, well, if you know what will be driving behavior in a particular situation, you could create what's called a nudge. The term has become popular after the famous examples from Dick Thaler, another seminal author and thinker in the field of risk and uncertainty and behavioral economics more generally. So we need to. That's exactly what my mission is, right? Like, if we understand better at a deeper level what's driving behavior, what are the interventions we can design that will be more effective? And often, trial and error is involved, because theory informs us to do things, but then we need to experiment to see what sticks, what works. So a general recommendation I have for practitioners is try to run experiments, play with things. Don't worry if it doesn't work well, if it fails. I mean, we learn so much by trial and error. This trial and error should be informed by theory, by good thinking, and that's kind of my side, my contribution in some cases. But we really need to do a lot of experimenting.
So then would it be right to say that looking at how people make decisions and risk perception, it's not just in the phase, in the workforce phase where people are doing behaviors. You can even take that to the development phase of the environment, right? Because if you have those little nudges in there designed in, then you're working collaboratively, you're designing the environment in a way that you've assessed things, right? And then you can make it so that when people are working in the environment, there's little nudges.
Exactly.
Do you want me to give you an example?
Sure.
So like I'm thinking, because I'm from grocery retail, I'm thinking in the deli, you've got people of all different heights using the slicer, for example. And one of the problems is that with the slicer, when that the meat gets everything wet, of course it starts sliding because you've got metal on metal. Right? Now, could you imagine a short person trying to do the slicer and it starts to slide? That can become a very dangerous situation.
Exactly.
Right? So one, designing tabletops so that they have anti-slip surfaces for those commercial devices to go on. And two, I would think designing what the device goes on or something around so that you can accommodate for different heights.
Yes.
Right. So
exactly.
whatever height the person is, you get the machine to the proper ergonomic level for that individual worker.
Yes.
What are your
Absolutely.
thoughts around those things?
Yeah, that you just gave a pretty good example here of an example, a case where one size doesn't fit all, and we need to recognize those differences and perhaps redesign the environment or the equipment or whatever. Yeah, the entire architecture so that it works safely for everybody. Or yeah, absolutely, that's a pretty nice example. Yes, indeed.
So this is clearly your passion area, right?
Yes, I've dedicated so much research. Early on, my work was more in like behavioral economics. How do we measure a person's risk attitude? A person,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm talking about even like financial risks, or like could we parameterize? Could we measure individuals' risk appetites so that we can help them make better decisions that would be more aligned with the level of risk they can fathom. So that's where my research started. And it was empirical, experimental research. I was looking at different methods for measuring risk attitude, and you find, of course, human nature is not easy to put in equations, but we can to some extent, right? And so you find that different ways of approaching things lead to different results, inconsistent results. So a lot of my early work was on understanding how could we better measure individual differences in risk taking. Mm-hmm. That was one thing. And that's much more general than safety. That's about investments and all of what we call now behavioral economics. I also was interested in how people make trade-offs, like how people balance competing objectives, between time and money, and between, we always do that in the decisions we make every day. We have to balance competing objectives. And again, I found that if you ask people to trade off money for days of vacation, you get a measure of their preferences there. But if you ask them to trade off days of vacation for money, you give them the money and say, how many days of vacation will you give up or sacrifice for this extra money? You get a different reading. So my point is that when we try to measure things that go to the heart of what we are, we have beliefs, we have preferences, it's very challenging to do that because we are not robots. We are not, you know, we tend to be inconsistent. We tend to give more weight to one aspect of things if it is emphasized to us. But if you shine the light on another aspect of things, then people will give more weight to that. So you need to reckon with all these things if you want to design and, you know, things that work for people, but also if you want to help them see through these little biases and penchants we have, to sort of get better at accomplishing what we want or what we need. So that really, yeah, you could say my passion has been in sort of deciphering all these aspects of things. And more recently, I have, with one of my colleagues from Bocconi University, Alessandra Cillo, we have been looking at measures of risk that are now for, you know, statistics and mathematics. How do we measure risk in a way that resonates better with whatever people mean by risk when they, if you ask people, what is risk for you? You know, what makes something riskier than something else, right? Well, there are different determinants there. And could we design mathematical measures of risk that we could use in finance and other disciplines that would be a little closer to behavior again? So the holy grail through what I've been doing is to link behavioral reality with a normative and logical consistency. Basically, that has been my kind of the underlying thread through what I do.
Now, and that's very important in health and safety, right? Because we're wanting people to make decisions so their behavior matches, keeping the environment a safe place for everybody who's in it, not just themselves, but it could be customers, it could be other workers, etc. Right? And
Absolutely.
so one of the things that's coming to my head is you were talking about how people make decisions. And I don't think that's something that we talk about a lot in health and safety. We leap to the perception that people ought to have had common sense. People ought to have just known, but that's not the truth of the equation, is it?
That's right. That's what the behavioral research tells us. I forgot now who is the author of the famous citation, "Common sense is not so common." I think it's Voltaire, or maybe I'm wrong about this, but yes. See, the thing is, if you want to get better outcomes, at some point you could frame safety as health and safety as it's just a bunch of rules to apply, a bunch of boxes to check and rules. And how do you get people to comply and to apply the rules? That's the one thing. At another level, you could frame it as, how do you make this to be second nature for people, that they will more naturally do it? In the 70s, when seat belts in cars became mandatory, it was an uphill battle to get people to buckle the belt, right? Nowadays, mostly people do it very naturally. They don't even think about it. But you have to remember, it was such an uphill battle at the time. Why? Because simply people felt safe in their car. They felt totally safe. They didn't feel exposed to any kind of danger and so on. It really took a lot of work and effort through different converging ways, a little bit of enforcement and, the carrot and the stick and so on, but other things as well.
Do you think that might be because the car evolved over time, right? So the car was not the machine that, when we had seat belts and the accidents that were occurring, or the incidents that were occurring, when the car first came out, it was pretty slow. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The engine in it was pretty slow. I mean, I even remember my dad saying, when the first came out, you could basically run beside a car. Yes. I laughed at him. I was like, really? He's like, yep. He goes, cars were not that fast when they first came out. A horse was faster.
Yeah.
Could that have something to do with our perception?
Yeah. Well, yes. And the other thing is that, maybe cars, well, yes, nowadays cars in Paris are as slow as horses used to be because of congestion, right? So,
yeah.
So the other thing is, yeah, maybe car, but you know, cars were also less safely designed. They were more dangerous.
Okay.
Maybe they were slower way back, but in the 70s, cars were pretty fast already.
But you said something
And
about normative. What does that
yeah,
mean, normative, for our audience?
normative. So normative as opposed to descriptive. You know, normative means the notion that a normative theory is a theory that purports to explain what should be, what would be the rational thing, the desirable thing to do, okay? So it's a norm. It essentially posits norms for behavior, norms for rationality. So the normative theory of behavior is the theory that posits what people should be doing, as opposed to, by contrast, to a descriptive theory that essentially tries to explain what people actually do, regardless of whether it is correct or not, rational or not. It is descriptive. It is the theory of what is, not what ought to be, right? So that is really the difference there. Yes.
So how does now normative behavior, explain to our audience about that, because I think that's a piece of this that we don't talk about too.
Well, normative is essentially trying to get to a higher level of rationality, to understand better what is right for me. I mean, we have had heated debates and discussions recently with vaccination for COVID, and those debates are not even new, and they will be there with us in the future. The question is, what is the right thing for a person to do?
Right.
People have different beliefs, different perceptions of the risk they are exposed to. A normative, a normative theory would say, if you had a 5% chance of dying by not being vaccinated, and only a 1% chance of dying by being vaccinated, what should you do? Well, clearly, I want to choose the gamble that has the better odds for me. I should get vaccinated. It's only a 1% chance of something bad happening to me as opposed to a 5% chance. But you know, for most people, for some people at least, this is not going. So that's what the normative theory says. Says, look, if you're going to have to play Russian roulette, you ought to pick up the gun that has one bullet instead of 5 in it, right? But that is not going to fly very well. Some people who might say, you know, this 1% chance you're telling me, this 5% chance, the 5% chance of dying from a disease you're talking about, you know, that's an average probability. That's 5% is the average. This doesn't apply to me. My probability is much less than 5%, so I don't accept that reasoning. My gamble, the gamble that I'm taking, is not the one you're describing to me. So you see, there's another layer of complexity here. People say, you know, I'm better at following precautions, at washing my hands, at doing all the right behavior to mitigate, you know, my exposure to the disease, to the virus, and so on. But in that reasoning, people may not realize that they are overestimating, you know, the favorability of. There's famous research in the 80s by Ola Svensson, a famous Swedish psychologist, who found that 80% of drivers believe they are safer drivers than 90% of the population. Most people believe they are a much better than average driver, much better driver than the average driver out there. So again, normative theory says, okay, you should do A, B, C because the numbers show, you know, A is better than B or better than C and so on. But then you need to go a little deeper to sort of look at other layers of things to find that, well, people will not accept that easily. People, you know, there are many other things that will contribute to people, you know, to the decisions people make. That was just one example that came to mind because, of course, we've all, you know, we've all heard pros and cons arguments there. And the question is not so much to try to dictate what should be done, is can we talk about this better? Can we enlighten the debate, you know, shine better light on the debate so that we will perhaps stop talking past each other, right? But talking to the issues more productively, perhaps.
Now, in the beginning of our conversation, you also said that there was lessons that could be applied to health and safety. Can you share what you were meaning by that?
Well, yeah, lessons that could be applied are, some of what I've said are examples of that are, could you educate your workforce a little better? Could you just make them more aware about that their perceptions of risk may not be accurate? And there's little experiments we could do with that. We could do it via little questionnaires, via we could get people to develop a little more healthy skepticism about their own ability to understand the risk they are facing. So
as
that's
well
one
as others.
as well, exactly. So that's one approach is, being an academic, of course, I believe in education, and that's something to that I will always advocate. Like, let's focus on how do we train people better, educate them at some level, and not patronize them. So that's one thing. And then of course, all of the nudges and the designing the choice architecture, of which you gave yourself examples before, these are things really that we have learned, from behavioral research. And we keep learning more. I believe that we have kind of collected the low-hanging fruit already, but there's more to do as we further our research agenda here. So hopefully the future holds more keys and more insights for us for how do we get more better outcomes in health and safety.
And, thinking about the nudges, that would be really also good in the leadership camp, right? That could be a tool, because nudges can be physical, but they can also be through communication,
Yes.
right? So maybe you can explain the difference between the physical nudges and the communication nudges, because I think that's also a tool that's not used a lot in health and safety. It really should be,
Yes.
in my opinion.
So I'm maybe I'm putting words on let me restate, what I believe you mean by physical nudges versus kind of mental nudges. Well, a physical nudge would be clearly a device, that
Well, if we go back to the slicer,
prevents people to do certain things, right? And there are many examples of that. One example that I used recently is I was driving on a divided highway, and when you pass a car, you're driving on the so that's in France. So you drive on the right side of the road, and you pass on the left side. But what the authorities want you to do is to keep right, if you're not passing, right? So they paved the passing lane, the left lane, with a coarser, more noisy, less comfortable a surface, so that naturally you will tend to keep right, to keep on the right. There are many nudges of that type. So that those would be like physical nudges. The other day I was looking at this beautiful monument in Fontainebleau, France, where I was touring, I was staying, and to prevent pigeons to come and be on the side of the window, you have got these spikes, right? Those spikes are nudges for pigeons, to prevent them from perching, from getting there. Now, mental nudges would be they would be more things that where you have been able to change a person's perceptions or belief about something. And those are much more subtle. Those are more like long-term, interventions. And I don't have a good example coming to my mind just at that moment. But
one of them could be, like, you remember the slicer I was talking about?
Yeah, no.
So maybe you might have a device that might help with leveling the height.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But if a worker doesn't use it, a verbal communication nudge would be, again, letting the worker know, hey, remember, we have the capability to reset this to your height. Use that.
Yes.
right?
But still, yeah, no,
Would
that's
that be
right.
a communication nudge?
Yeah, that would be, but that still involves a physical nudge. Like, I
Okay.
just had an example of a mental nudge, if you will,
Yep.
that may not be directly related to safety, but it bears on it because it has to do with risk. I have a friend who regularly buys a lottery ticket, regularly, for $2, just to get a shot at making a big bundle of money, hopefully. And so he tells me, he told me about that, and I said, oh, I never buy a lottery ticket, but I always win, because I reckon that by not buying a lottery ticket, I save myself $2, right? And if I look at my accumulated savings and therefore earnings for many, many years, I told him, I think I'm ahead of you, because he was telling me that he won a small prize once, like $150 or something like that. And I said, oh, by now my savings, my earnings by not playing exceed yours, okay? So that would be an example of a mental nudge, like flipping something in your head, whether you could view it one way, my not buying a lottery ticket, I always win, it's kind of a, flipping it in your head a little bit. And I believe we need to be more creative about interventions like this. How do you get people to think differently about the choices they face in some cases, so that they can see maybe more clearly? And in regards to safety, they might see the safety issue involved with more saliency, and maybe again we can get better outcomes. That is an example for me of what a mental nudge might be.
Okay, so it helps change perception.
Exactly. It's a
Right.
change of perception, change of framing. We call it framing in the jargon of behavioral science.
So I'm going to change direction a little bit, because I understand that you're speaking at the EHS. I understand that you're speaking at the EHS Congress in September. So can you share a bit about what's the panel going to be speaking about that you're sitting on?
I think it'll be around some of the issues you and I discussed today here. The issues of getting better behavioral outcomes. How do we do that? Because ultimately it will be always the limiting factor. Human behavior, human judgment will be the bottleneck. Technology will help us get much safer, much better. Cars have become, we were talking about cars earlier. Clearly, cars nowadays are so much safer than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and 40 years ago. So clearly, spectacular progress have been made and will be made. Technology will keep improving, the game for us. But the limit will always be that moment where a human needs to exercise judgment, take an action, make a quick decision. And that is, I think, a big focus of our discussion will be, how do we get better behavioral outcomes? Because those are the hardest things to change.
Absolutely. No, they really are. And as you said before, a lot of it also weighs on people's life experiences and what people have gone through in their own journey for their own perception in order to assess and look at something. Now, we are almost at the end of our time, but before we go, I wanted to ask, was there anything that you wanted to share with our audience before we go?
Well, I wanted to say, come to Berlin for EHS, for the EHS Congress, if you can. That promises to be a great, a great event. And stay tuned for all these things, because I am one voice among many others, but it's just the convergence of all the perspectives you, Tamara, and others are bringing together that will, get us to keep improving things. So stay tuned, basically.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Philippe. It's wonderful to have you here.
My pleasure. Pleasure as always to speak with you, Tamara.
Thank you. And thank you, audience, for listening. If you enjoyed our interview, please remember to press the like button. If you want to hear more, click on the subscribe. And again, thank you, Philippe, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the EHS Congress on September the 13th and 14th in Berlin. So click the link below in order to learn more about that. And if you're looking for some health and safety resources and content to share out with your team, visit us at safeopedia.com. Until next time, stay safe.